You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 8th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, another night of bombs in Beirut. We'll have the latest from the Lebanese capital and also shift the focus to asking when Israel will retaliate against Iran. Also coming up in the next 60 minutes, 2 Chinese nationals are killed in a suspected suicide bombing near to Karachi airport. We'll examine the relationship between Pakistan and China. Plus,
those events on the campus changed the world, ultimately, and changed lives. And for the student journalist, there was no better opportunity to test yourself than that.
We shine a light on journalists combating the rise of AI. We'll hear about the UAE's plans to push its space programme and find out why the Taliban are making money out of Afghan airspace. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Ukraine's foreign minister has denounced Russian missile attacks on 2 civilian cargo ships as a deliberate terrorist tactic. North Korea's Kim Jong-un said he'll step up steps to making his country a military superpower and strong nuclear power. And Haiti's foreign minister has criticised a policy announced by the neighbours, Dominican Republic, to deport tens of thousands of migrants back into Haiti, where gang violence is fueling a devastating humanitarian crisis. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories, but first, the focus on the Middle East yesterday was dominated by the first anniversary of Hamas attack on Israel. While those in their thousands paused to mark the event, the bombs did not fall silent. Both in Gaza, in Lebanon and in Israel, hostilities continued. Well, for the latest, I'm joined now by Leila Malana-Allen, who's Monocle's Middle East correspondent. She joins me on the line from Beirut. A very good morning to you, Leila.
Morning.
It's been widely reported that Israel hit several targets in Beirut last night. Could you bring us up to date, please?
It did. We've been seeing over the last few nights a huge escalation in the strikes here in Beirut. You know, when I arrived a bit over a week ago, it was at least around Beirut, a couple in the day, a couple at night. Now it's so frequent that you can hear bombs going off all through the day and all through the night. And there are far fewer warnings as well. It comes with far less notice. So the southern suburbs of Beirut, which are predominantly run by Hezbollah, have been in areas flattened. We're talking about huge high-rise blocks that have been brought down. These are residential areas where tens of thousands of people live. Many people have evacuated from those areas. More than a quarter of Lebanon's population now has been displaced by these attacks. Of course, in the south, there's absolute destruction of all the villages along the border. And the evacuation zone there has grown hugely as well. We saw yesterday an evacuation notice all the way up to Saida, which is a city on the southern coast. That's essentially a third of the country now that Israel is asking people to evacuate from. And we've also seen now images coming out from the border of villages completely flattened there. The intention, of course, of the IDF being to create a pathway for tanks to be able to drive through if there is an increased ground invasion, because we know the IDF troops down there have been having an incredibly hard time fighting with Hezbollah fighters on the border, who of course know the terrain very well. So they're trying to make a clearer path to be able to actually bring in heavy weaponry there and be able to start an invasion proper.
Given the intensity of what you've just described, to what degree does Lebanon now feel on a war footing?
What's very strange here is, a lot of the coverage kind of talks about an escalating road towards war. People in Lebanon feel they've been at war for at least 2 weeks. As I say, a quarter of the country displaced. That's 1.2 million people. with nowhere to go. This is a country that's been through a huge financial crisis over the last 5 years. The government's in no fit state to be dealing with this crisis. Everywhere you look, people are sleeping on the street. Every morning you wake up, there are more people. I'm talking about, mothers and young children sleeping outside in the baking heat. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough water. The people helping them are local charities, local individuals. There's no kind of state response to this except on a municipal level where local governors are able to do something. And all through the day, the city shakes. I mean, the air is full of black smoke. Major cities in the south, as I say, now are having evacuation orders as well. I've been spending a lot of time down in Zaida, where a lot of patients had been evacuated to from those strikes, and now they're having to leave again. So it's a full war footing here. And of course, just a reminder that, people who don't necessarily know the context in Lebanon might be slightly confused about why the Lebanese army is not fighting the IDF, who is invading Lebanese territory. Currently, the case is that there haven't been full-scale battles between the Lebanese armed forces and the IDF. That could change. But in the south, it's mostly Hezbollah troops. The reason for that is partly that the south is a very Hezbollah-supporting area, and it's a Shia area, although not all Shia support Hezbollah by any means. But it's also because the Lebanese armed forces essentially are hamstrung by their allies who support and train them, which are the same allies that support and train Israel. So mostly America, the UK and France arm the Lebanese armed forces, but they only arm them in a defensive capacity. They've never allowed them offensive capability because Israel does not want that. What that means is it's created a gulf in their capability, the Lebanese armed forces being the only military unit here in the country that is mixed between all sects and all groups and represents everyone. And that's the excuse that Hezbollah has used for years to be able to build more weaponry up, because the Lebanese armed forces simply aren't in a position to defend against Israel. And of course, Israel does regularly attack. And the last time we saw a major war here was 2006. So while there are lots of people in this country who don't support Hezbollah, they certainly don't support Israel invading the country by air and by land either. And currently, Hezbollah is the only group in a position to fight off that invasion.
What you described there places large swathes of the international community in a quandary in terms of what to say, how much to intervene. We've had in the last 24 hours, as you say, following the airstrikes in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is near to the airport, we now have the US State Department intervening. A spokesperson, Matthew Miller, has said Israel must not attack Beirut airport or the roads leading to it. There is a desire to retain the essential infrastructure of Lebanon, isn't there?
There is a desire to retain the essential infrastructure of Lebanon. Nobody wants the scenes that were seen in 2006 where desperate families and diplomats and people with dual nationality were evacuating on aircraft carriers out of the port. But just to be really clear, people here are incredibly angry because they don't see that as America supporting the basic rights of the Lebanese people to not be under a blockade, which is what would happen if the airport and the ports were taken out. What they see that as is the Western allies essentially protecting their own, not wanting their foreign staff here to be unable to evacuate from the country, and negotiating with the IDF to keep the airport running so long as they're trying to get people out of the country. Many people here feel that they'll be abandoned once that happens, because of course we're in this situation where the United States and to a lesser extent other allies, the United Kingdom and France, Germany, have provided the weaponry, the bombs to Israel that are now being used against Lebanon and Beirut, and then are turning around. Anthony Blinken said the other day that the US is providing $157 million in aid to Lebanon. So this very odd situation where the weaponry is provided by the same side that's then providing the aid to try and help people displaced by that destruction. People here are very angry about that. They think that the global order is broken and that essentially there's no real consideration for the Lebanese people and the suffering that civilians are going through here. And they really are befuddled as to why the international community is sort of making these vague statements but not actively doing anything to stop the destruction of this country and this city, which, by the way, is not just important for the Lebanese, but deeply important for the nearly 500,000 Palestinian refugees who live in this country, more than 1 million Syrian refugees who live in this country, which Lebanon supports. So this is an incredibly important place in the region to all peoples here, and currently they feel completely abandoned.
Leila, let's move on to another key part of this conflict, which is what the retaliation towards Iran will be from Israel after it fired ballistic missiles towards Israel last week. There is pressure on Israel to hit big targets from within Israel, at least. And the Israelis will need the Americans for the second round of this. Do we have any idea about what shape this retaliation against Iran is expected to be? And to all intents and purposes, whether it will happen soon?
The expectations change every day. 2 nights ago, all the airspace over this region cleared and everyone thought, oh, right, there have been warnings that it's going to happen tonight. It didn't happen. Last night, there were explosions in the Iranian city of Isfahan. Everyone panicked and said, oh, right, that's it. It wasn't. It was a localized industrial issue that caused some electrical explosions, it appears. So everybody is very much on edge about what could take place. What seems very clear, as with many of the other issues here, ceasefires and what's going to happen moving forward, is that there is intense negotiation going on behind the scenes between Israel and its allies, particularly the United States, which of course does want to deconflict, but also doesn't want to move back from its stance that Israel, as it says, has the right to protect itself, and that it supports Israel in its defensive stance. So what we're seeing now, essentially, is the United States trying to accept that Israel needs to do something, but not wanting it to escalate further, because, of course, Iran would be not only a third front in this conflict, but a very significant one. That's a huge country that has significant nuclear facilities. The big fear is that Israel will try to hit those nuclear facilities. That is something that's always been off the cards. It's always just been not a possibility. But what's been seen over the last few weeks, the last few months, is an increasing unwillingness from the Israeli government, from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to listen to their allies, to actually show restraint. What seems very clear is they're in a position now where they're saying, we are going to do everything we want to do now. Now is our opportunity. We've devastated Gaza. There's new orders now that they're going to clear the north of Gaza. It's very possible that people will not be allowed to go back there. Now Lebanon is being attacked on an increasing daily basis as well. And it seems very clear that the IDF and the government in Israel have decided that this is their opportunity to get rid of the threats that they feel they've been targeted by for years. Now, of course, public opinion inside Israel wants a huge strike against Iran. Usually Israel is very able to defend it all the time, but the Israeli capability is quite incredible. I've stood under those rockets coming in, and this Iron Dome system they have provided by the Americans really does manage to tackle 95% of those rockets coming in before they make impact anywhere. Obviously, there are also air raid sirens everywhere and shelters. So the country is very well set up. The issue the other night, where nearly 200 ballistic missiles came in, is that quite a lot of them did make impact. They weren't able to kill anyone. Just one person, very sadly, was killed by a falling piece of a rocket. But there was a lot of concern inside Israeli society and inside the defense ministry about realizing both that Iran has that capability and that they were willing to use it. So they want to show a show of force. They want to show that, as Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant have said, Iran is not a front too far for us. We can strike everywhere, but everyone else desperate to make sure that it's not another escalation that will force Iran to actually retaliate and to end some sort of war. It's really unclear at the moment how far Israel will listen to those warnings.
Layla Malala Allen, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Beirut. You're listening to The Globalist. Let's continue now with today's papers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is the international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor, Nina Dos Santos. Good morning, Nina. How is life in the Dos Santos world?
All good, thanks.
What are you up to? Good stuff?
Yeah. Not much really, apart from sort of getting used to the winter weather kicking in. It's getting nice and cosy in this part of the world, isn't it?
Filthy, isn't it? Absolutely awful.
Gives you time to wake up early and read the newspapers before it's actually dawn now, when it's dark. So here's what I found today that I thought was quite interesting, Emma.
Okay.
Let's start out with somewhere where it's even colder and times are even darker, and that is, of course, Ukraine, now sort of 3 years into the war, and fatigue is setting in, concerns about whether or not Western support is starting to wane, and that age-old issue of corruption is starting to make the newspapers here. Now, it's estimated that Ukraine foots a bill of about £4 billion or $5.4 billion each year. That's the cost of corruption to its people. And as you can imagine, at the moment, this is a really thorny issue because Russia has tried repeatedly over various successive decades to try and paint Ukraine as a sort of corrupt, failed state. You can imagine that they're trying to do that yet again to try and sap support for the war effort. But Ukraine says, on the other hand, it's really important that with its 3 anti-corruption agencies, it continues to root out corruption and to highlight it, just to show that it's doing something about the issue and to put it on the right track for EU accession. Now, The Times has a really interesting piece about how one of the heads of these anti-corruption agencies has been going after local officials who are taking money from draft dodgers. So this is people, men, obviously, who are trying to avoid fighting on the front line in Ukraine to defend the country, and asking for fake disability certificates as a result. And they're using, in the start of this emotive article, one example of a woman who apparently had stashed away up to $5 million worth of cash in her own local house in the middle of nowhere in Ukraine, and also managed to buy flats in Turkey and other EU countries as well with the proceeds of these corrupt payments to try and help people avoid, defending their country at a time like this. So Ukraine's trying to defend its reputation as well as defending its borders too.
And this is a reputation that could determine the amount of support that it receives. Because if the international community, having pledged so much support, unending, unwavering support to Ukraine, finds out that the money and the resources that it has given are not ending up in the intended hands, that could really change things.
Absolutely. Well, we've already seen evidence of that over the last year or two. You'll remember the $60-odd billion package that was held up so badly amid wrangling in the US Congress. Lots of that was amid concerns over whether or not defence officials could have, were under investigation for corruption and could have been potentially, at least parts of the apparatus there in Kyiv could have been, siphoning off some of those payments. Also, remember that Germany was very reluctant to send big weaponry in, and particularly its Leopard tanks and stuff like that. Again, countries like Germany saying, well, look, we cannot afford to be sending stuff if some of it is going to be ending up in the hands of corrupt officials. Look, let's face it, war always encourages profiteering. I'm sure that in years to come, when there'll be extra money that goes towards Ukraine to try and help rebuild the country, again, allegations of corruption will probably raise their ugly heads. But what's interesting about this individual who runs one of these anti-corruption agencies in the Times and the interview that he's given us, as I said, you've got this he's a very young person, you've got this young generation, you've got Zelensky who came in 2019 promising to stamp out this type of corruption. As I was saying before, they're in this interesting reputational balance mode at the moment where they have to highlight it and highlight the progress that they're making, but each time they highlight the progress that they're making, it highlights the fact that corruption still exists.
It's an interesting thing insofar as Volodymyr Zelensky, before he became a war president, was a man who had been elected to root out corruption. And the irony is that the whole invasion from Russia has precipitated Kyiv's journey towards the European Union, which insists that corruption is dealt with before it even agrees to start talks. It's such a dreadful problem for Ukraine to face, isn't it? It is determined to get EU membership. But the problem is not because of war, it is because of the internal problem, the internal corruption issues.
That's right. But let's face it, Ukraine has, ever since Viktor Yanukovych was booted out, and you remember everybody found his golden dacha hidden away with, a zoo and, huge white Steinway piano that was signed by John Lennon, all these wonderful trappings of gold taps and so on and so forth. And you'll remember all those television pictures when he had to flee to Moscow in a helicopter, and people entered this house and said, well, heaven forbid, how could all of this have been stolen from us? And then it turned out that a lot of that money and that entire building was owned outside of Ukraine. So one of the things that probably Ukrainian organisations will want to do is also to say to other Western countries, including the United Kingdom, please stop allowing the proceeds of corruption to be funneled through European countries that supposedly uphold all of these anti-corruption values, because the reality is that once money is stolen from places like Ukraine, it goes to buy flats inside the EU. So that is the irony that many Ukrainians, I think, would probably point out, Emma.
Let's move on to, we were talking about allegations of cronyism. Let's go to London.
Back to London.
Tell us what's happening.
No issue there.
Tell us what's happening in the House of Lords. A complicated house, the upper house of the of Britain's Parliament. The members who are placed there, who sort of are the kind of like the backstop, the checks and balances of any new legislation that comes through has to go through the House of Lords. But the people who sit in the House of Lords, their very nature is always an issue of contention, isn't it?
That's right. So essentially what we're seeing, as per a report in the Times as well today, is that the new Labour government is planning on taking back up some of the work that the last Labour government was trying to finish off under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the mid-2000s and late 90s. This is the idea of reforming the upper house, as you were saying before, the House of Lords, which is inhabited by, I think, 90-odd hereditary peers. So this concept, to anybody who's not British, it's very familiar to those of us who are British, means that there are a number of people in the House of Lords who are hereditary peers, so sit there and have a say on legislation in this country, as you're saying, the final tick on legislation, and have a sort of veto on it, based only on the fact that they were born as aristocrats. Now, the Labour government wants to finish off the job of the last Labour government, which is to scrap the concept of hereditary peerage, so to phase out those lords who have that role. But then what it also wants to do is prevent any political party from being able to appoint its own people without proper scrutiny and gain a majority then to sort of swing votes in the House of Lords. What they also want to do is to prevent people from donating very heavily to a party and then eventually getting rewarded with a peerage. By the way, the irony is, as I was saying before, under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's time, was the last time we saw sort of meaningful attempts to reform the upper house of Parliament in the UK. It was ironic that even Tony Blair back in those days was involved in a reputationally damaging allegation of offering peerages to donors for their support. So this is a really thorny issue, but it is one that Labour has promised. There will be detractors who will say, yeah, this is Labour yet again taking on the class system in the UK after its attempts to try and smash the private school hold over the top positions in this country. But I think it's going to have a lot more support than that issue over the private school fees. I think this is really one that people probably eventually won't put up much of a fuss against, because there's been real concerns all the way back since Lloyd George, decades and decades and decades ago, that the House of Lords has been used to reward people for their support either financially or, politically.
Let's move on to a story in the Wall Street Journal. Excuse me. A perennial observation made by those outside Europe, which is it ungovernable? It's a great answer. It's a great question. It happens about every 5 years that someone else decides that Europe is too big, too cumbersome, too tricky to look after itself.
That's right. This is a piece written by, actually, full disclosure, a friend of mine, Bojan Panchevsky, who I first met on the Brussels circuit many years ago. He's based now in Berlin. And he has written what I think is a very, very valid piece today at the moment, essentially questioning whether or not Europe is increasingly becoming ungovernable. Now, that's not because the EU is comprised now of many more member states. It'll be even harder to govern, I'd have thought, when Ukraine eventually becomes a member. But it's really the problem that he's pointing out here is that the two big states that are the engines of Europe and normally call the shots, France and Germany, are finding themselves ungovernable. You remember that recently when Geert Wilders of the Freedom Party in the Netherlands took home the most votes, it took 6 months for the Netherlands to form a government. That is actually quite common among some of the member states, fraught coalition politics. But when you start to see it in France and Germany, it's a real problem. And it's a problem for Germany because the AfD, the far-right party, I think is now second in the polls nationally after its 3 big successes in recent Eastern German regional elections. Germany has national elections coming up, general elections in a year's time. And its traffic light coalition is extremely unpopular. The two parties that support the Social Democrats in that coalition, Olaf Scholz's coalition partners, the Greens, and also the Free Democrats, are seeing their support eroded hugely in the polls. So they're sort of stuck. And if they can pass any legislation, it's not really the legislation that is a priority for voters. Likewise, if you look at France, Macron called an election nobody really seemed to think was needed or wanted. And then when the left scooped up most of the votes, albeit by a small margin, they ended up with a centre-right government. So the point that Boyan is making here is that across the whole of the EU, what this does is it undermines faith in the institutions themselves.
Let's move on finally to... Nina and I quite like talking about languages, foreign languages, when we're not on
German,
there. Particularly German. My constant strive to try and reclaim it. You found an article in The Guardian today about the inclusion of the apostrophe, which in German, as far as I can gather, is streng verboten.
Yeah, absolutely, except we're talking about the Deppenapostrophe here.
The
Deppenapostrophe.
We're going deep here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, which The Guardian translates as idiot's apostrophe, but I would... Personally, from my memories of studying a little bit in Germany, I would also perhaps translate that more colloquially as the thickos apostrophe. Might that be right? I don't know.
It's making...
Deppenapostrophe. So apparently, according to German language bodies, they have decreed, so this is the equivalent of the Oxford English Dictionary decreeing this every year, that actually the apostrophe in its possessive or genitive form as it's used, so like Rosa's bar or, Eva's florist shop with an apostrophe, is now not streng verboten, which means impermissible anymore. It is fine, because it's so widely used. For anybody who doesn't know German and doesn't know German grammar, one of the wonderful things about German grammar is both its complexity and its simplicity, particularly when it comes to apostrophes, because you just forget the apostrophe and you just stick the S on the back with no apostrophe.
Depending on the gender.
Well, perhaps. I don't think we've got long enough to explain that without, especially on radio.
We're wildly inside baseball here. I love this article because it explains just how German the Germans are. And I love Germany. The Guardian talks about a commentator in the tabloid Bild. So this is a tabloid, ladies and gentlemen, saying that they saw a sign like Harald's Eck, Harold's Corner, and it had made his hair stand on end, and that the proper use of the genitive form would be bemoaned by lovers of the German language. Would you ever see that in any other tabloid on earth?
Well, certainly not in the Star. Or the Sun, I suppose. I don't know. Half of the time, it's the aliens what done it on the front page of the British tabloids that breaks any grammatical rule in English. But it's funny that you mentioned the Bild columnist, because I was reading the one by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is obviously not tabloid, it's more of a broadsheet, and it was saying that the fact that they've included this apostrophe is further proof of the victory march of the English language. And it was saying that essentially including the idiot's apostrophe now in the German vernacular amounts to genuflecting to English, and they're not having it by any means.
We've come to the end.
That's für eine Schade. What a shame.
We've come to the end of the world, clearly. Nina Dos Santos, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. A quick look now at the rest of today's headlines. Ukraine's foreign minister has denounced Russian missile attacks on 2 vessels in its southern ports as deliberate terrorist tactics. Angel Sibia posted on social media that in just 2 days, Russian ballistic attacks damaged 2 civilian cargo vessels in Odessa. He called on other countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Black Sea and global food security. North Korea's Kim Jong-un says he'll speed up steps towards making his country a military superpower. The South Korean news agency News One also reported that he intends to make the country a strong nuclear power. And Haiti's foreign minister has criticised a policy announced last week by the Dominican Republic to deport tens of thousands of migrants back into Haiti, where gang violence is fueling a devastating humanitarian crisis. The foreign minister added that the brutal scenes of roundups and deportations are an affront to human dignity. And those are the headlines on The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, Two nationals from China have been killed and at least 10 people have been injured in a suspected suicide bombing near to Karachi airport in Pakistan. The Chinese embassy in Pakistan has said the explosion was a terrorist attack. To tell us more, we're joined now by Aisha Siddiqa, who's a senior fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. A very good morning to you, Aisha.
Hi, good morning.
So tell us what's happened.
Well, it's a terrorist attack, as you've heard, which has killed 2 Chinese and injured about another 10 people, which include Pakistanis as well. And this was an attack carried out allegedly by the Baloch Liberation Army, which is an insurgent movement, and it's a terrorist group working for separation of Balochistan, that's southwestern province of Pakistan. From Pakistan. And this is this is the latest attack in a series of attacks which has been carried out against the Chinese by the BLA, and also which is Baloch Liberation Army, and also there was another one earlier this year by the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, another part of the country. But Chinese are being targeted in Pakistan.
Tell us a little bit more about the background to this and why the Balochistan Liberation Army exists and what it intends to do.
Well, Balochistan Liberation Army is an insurgent separatist movement which has been there because it is struggling to free southwestern part of Pakistan from Pakistan. And their claim is that this was a princely state at the time of 1947 when India got free. Got free from British rule and then separated to become Pakistan and India. So it was a princely state, and at the time of partition, what the British had done, the colonial force, was that there were the Muslim majority areas were made Pakistan. The Hindu majority areas were made India, but then there were hundreds of princely states which were allowed to either join India or Pakistan. But there is an ongoing issue of Kashmir, which was another princely state. Balochistan was also was not a princely state, but it was it was a kind of a princely state ruled by the Nawabs. And there was a forced accession. That's the claim, that they did not happily join Pakistan. But it was, and that's a fact, that military was sent to take over Balochistan. And so, since then, the other issue that they have is that their resources like natural gas, which is taken from Balochistan, but Balochistan was one of the last provinces of Pakistan which got to use natural gas for themselves. And one of the most important problems that has occurred is that the issue of disappearances. So the Pakistani state used authoritarianism. People are picked up, they go missing, they're killed, the bodies are never returned. So these are some of the issues. But I think it's also important to point out that PLA has been fighting, but the Pakistani state has also not been kind of very robust in providing security for the Chinese. The PLA has been targeting Chinese because they believe that China is partnering with Pakistan as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor Agreement. They're building projects in Pakistan, in Balochistan, which will eventually strengthen the Pakistani state. So they're targeting the Chinese. The Pakistani state is not doing sufficient to provide security.
Aisha Siddiqa, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. It is 11:38 a.m. in Kabul, 8:38 a.m. in Zurich. Now, the levels of poverty in Afghanistan since the Taliban took back power 3 years ago has been widely reported, chiefly because of the breathtakingly high amount of deprivation. The charity Save the Children estimates that 28% of the population, that's about 12.5 million people, will face acute food insecurity before October. What is less reported, however, is the amount of money that the Taliban is currently raking in and how it is doing so. Revenue amounted to $1 billion in the first quarter of this year, and some of that came from the use of Afghan airspace. Well, to explore this issue further, I'm joined by Kate Clark, a former BBC correspondent in Kabul and currently co-director of the Afghanistan Analysts Network. She joins me now. Good morning, Kate.
Good morning.
So the amount of money that the Taliban are making is significant. Why is this happening? Where's the money coming from?
Well, it's the crisis in the Middle East. And airlines not wanting to send their planes across places, across countries that may be having ballistic missile attacks or drones or whatever. Afghanistan has become a safer place than, for example, flying over Iran.
So explain logistically how this works then. If you are an airline, what is it that you can now do that you could not do before thanks to the Taliban accessing airspace?
So countries earn money when commercial flights fly through the air above them. And for Afghanistan, that would be $700 per flight. Airlines typically want to go the shortest way because that's the cheapest way for them in terms of fuel. However, if there's a security or a safety risk, they will fly around. And at the moment, the airlines are avoiding Iran, and Afghanistan is a much better, much safer alternative. And the Taliban are not recognised as the government of Afghanistan by any country in the world. However, they are what's called the de facto authorities, so the authorities in practice, and they get money from the overhead flights.
How much more is this contributing to the Taliban's coffers, and is there any sense that any of it will be distributed among the people?
So when the international powers pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, the economy shrank by about a quarter. That was mainly money that the countries like Britain and America had spent funding the Afghan military, the old government, against the Taliban. It was the money that the foreign army spent in Afghanistan. Aid has kept, the levels have kept quite up, but you can't. The country hasn't been able to make up for that lost income. So it's a disaster. It's been a complete disaster in terms of poverty, unemployment, people actually getting enough to eat. The Taliban have been pretty efficient about getting what revenue they can. They've been taxing people hard, including farmers on their harvest for the first time, customs, and of course the money coming in from things like flights. However, they've been really, really untransparent about how they're spending that money. So we reckon about half of it's going on paying soldiers and police, even when the health service, schools, I don't know, dealing with poverty desperately needs money.
How much is there a sense nowadays from the outside that the international community is having to work more with the Taliban, given the fact that they have been back in power for 3 years now? They are useful economically to the outside world, as you have just mentioned, in terms of the opening up of Afghan airspace, but also the fact that the practicalities of life get in the way.
So there's been a face-off since the Taliban took over in 2021. Countries like the UK will not fund the Taliban government in the way that they funded the old government. They don't want to ensure that the Taliban stay in power any day longer than they might. However, they recognise that there's a huge humanitarian need, actual need to save lives because of the parlous state of the economy. So they've put money through to humanitarian aid. not through the government, but through the UN and through NGOs. The Taliban, if it just did things like allow girls to go to school, go to secondary school and university, softened their laws on women and girls' freedom, allowed some people into the government that weren't Pashtun men. So Pashtun is one of the big ethnic communities in Afghanistan that the Taliban is largely made up of. So it's a very, very exclusive government. Male Islamic clerics from one ethnic group, the Pashtuns. And in a very diverse country, of course, that means it's completely unrepresentative. If the Taliban shifted on those issues, it would be much easier for countries like Britain to work with them as the de facto authorities. But there's a sort of face-off of politics and principles between the countries that are the big donors in Afghanistan and the rulers of Afghanistan, and neither really wants to budge.
Kate Clark, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
10:45 a.m. in Abu Dhabi, which is where we head next to find out what's making news in the United Arab Emirates. Mustafa Al-Wari, journalist and writer based in Abu Dhabi, joins me now. A very good morning to you, Mustafa. How's Abu Dhabi looking?
Good morning, Emma. A little bit overcast, which is nice, given that we've had such a hot summer.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. What's happening where you are?
Well, one of the big stories in the last day or so is the announcement of a new space council for the UAE. It's Supreme Space Council. It's supposed to oversee all of the UAE's investments and activities in the sector of space. That includes, for example, being a part of the NASA's Gateway project, a $5.3 billion space station that orbits the moon that the UAE is being involved in. Of course, in recent years, the UAE sent men to space. It's sent a probe to Mars, has attempted to land a rover on the moon. And so really they're thinking about the next sort of the future and which areas will be very, very important. And space is obviously one of them.
Just explain why the UAE has decided that it wants to jump into this area, because it is already, dare I say it, a pretty crowded market.
Sure. I think everybody knows about sort of the space junk story and how many satellites are up there. But I think this is beyond communications, beyond sort of what's happened before. The UAE is trying to future-proof its economy. Obviously, we all know that hydrocarbons has a limited shelf life, particularly as we push to net zero, as they have to look to other areas in which there could be growth, and not just resources in space, but also in technology, innovation, all these areas that promise to put an economy sort of in the lead, if you like, if they are at the forefront of that sector.
And just explain to us, I mean, behind the scenes, there is plenty going on and there is investment going on. But generally what happens is the great soft power step is when someone from, let's say, Dubai or UAE, someone from the UAE actually dons a spacesuit and climbs on board a mission somewhere. When is the likelihood of that happening?
So there have been two. So the first UAE astronaut, Hazza Al-Mazuri, went into space. And then later, Sultan Al-Neyadi actually went on a 6-month mission to the International Space Station. So we've already had that sort of soft power move, if you like. And now the next step is how can you actually, I guess, turn all of this investment and activity into economic value? And so, for example, they've announced a mission to an asteroid belt because people believe that asteroids will be the next sort of mining area, if you like. Also, as I said, they're investing in, or at least being a partner in the Gateway project, which promises to make the moon sort of much more of a sort of jumping off pad for space missions. It will be a lot easier if resources and men are already there. So it's moving from sort of the soft power PR sort of extravaganza that space tends to be in the past to something a little bit more tangible on the economic and investment front.
And tell us a little bit more about who the UAE will be happy to partner with. I mean, you mentioned work with NASA, but space is one of those places where soft and hard power meet. So we have these enormous rivalries: the United States, China, Russia, India. I mean, who does the UAE want to buddy up with here?
So, I mean, there are better experts than me would be able to give you a more in-depth answer. But generally, I can say that space, funnily enough, has been an area where there's been quite a bit of cooperation between nations. Russians, and until recently, of course, following the Ukraine invasion. But but Russia, the US, China, everybody's kind of collaborated. Space has been a little bit of a kind of area apart from the geopolitical rivalries that have gone on Earth. However, you quite rightly point out, as things get a bit more serious, then you kind of got to choose who your dance partner is. And I think that the UAE is making it very clear that the US is its partner of choice, not just from recent missions, but, for example, the president of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, was recently in the US meeting President Biden, the Vice President Kamala Harris as well. And one of the topics of discussion for that visit was collaboration in space. And the US and the UAE are also looking at collaboration in AI, for example, which will be closely related to any developments in the space sector. So I think the US and the UAE will be long-term partners in this.
Let's move slightly closer to Earth, but not exactly entirely earthbound. Let's talk about Emirates and its changing schedules and destinations. Geopolitics very firmly getting in the way here.
So there's been an escalation, I'm sure, as all the listeners know, in conflict in Lebanon. Most recently, we've had since for the past year in Gaza as well. And whenever there are missiles flying in airspace across Iran, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, then it tends to make air routes quite tricky to manage. And so and this happened last week, flights were cancelled outright. When the Iranian missile barrage flew towards Israel. But then, since then, the schedules have been kind of adapted because they're having to take longer routes round these troublesome spots to get flights to Europe and elsewhere, and particularly in the region. So obviously to Lebanon, there are no flights at the moment. Even the flight from Abu Dhabi to Tel Aviv has been suspended. We expect things to calm down in the next few weeks, but it just means anyone flying within the region, into the region, should be aware of these realities. I
mean, how swiftly and quickly can Emirates move things around here, given the fact that the situation in the Middle East is so acutely moving so fast?
Yeah, I think they have to find a kind of an air route that allows them to not have to keep changing schedules. So typically it takes a few days to adjust, but then they find a way to kind of get around most of the troublesome spots. For example, there was from Qatar, for example, recently there was a route sort of south and then around near Greece, which again, it just adds time, obviously burns more fuel, make inconvenience to passengers, but at least the safety is paramount. So they tend to manage this over quite well in recent years whenever there have been flare-ups. The Gulf region, and particularly Gulf aviation, is very resilient, has a lot of capabilities, and they really respond to these things quickly. But if you're trying to get to Lebanon, for example, you're going to be stuck for a while. That's not going to change immediately. But if you're hubbing through the region, it should be okay.
Mustafa Arawi, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Finally, Monocle's October edition of the magazine. We shine a light on journalists around the world, making a difference to the field and combating the rise of AI and fake news. For part of the feature, Monocle's Thomas Lewis sat down with Maria Hinojosa, the Pulitzer-winning radio host and producer, about her contributions to journalism.
I grew up at a time when immigrants were actually sought after in this country. It was a time of the brain drain of other countries was the brain gain in the United States, and my dad was part of that. He was a genius from a small city in Mexico, and the University of Chicago saw in him the genius that ultimately led him to be part of the team that created the cochlear implant. So when we were growing up, on the south side of Chicago in the late 1960s for me, early 70s. It was a very similar time of political turmoil in the country, and I grew up kind of consumed with things that were happening all around me. Again, very much like this moment in history. You know, I mean, I was 7 years old at the Democratic National Convention that happened in 1968. So I remember these things. And so therefore I was watching a lot of news. The television was our source of understanding the U.S. as new immigrants, and watching the evening news became kind of a ritual in our family. That's where the beginning of the love of journalism, it all starts. But the thing was that while I was fascinated, while I was being educated and informed, I never saw myself reflected in any way, whether it was giving the news or people like me. And so that kind of planted a seed of a sense of invisibility, so that the first thing I do when I get to college is I go to the college radio station, Columbia University's radio station, which back then radio was like our Twitter. Well, no more Twitter, but you know, it was what Twitter was in the heyday is what radio was back in the early 80s. And so I do kind of stake my claim in, I may have been invisible once, but I'm going to carve out a place for me.
And sort of interesting that maybe, well, I was just thinking of the student protests at Columbia. I actually was a student at Columbia years ago as well, at the journalism school there, probably just a little more than a decade ago. But the role of the student journalist, especially on radio, seemed to me during the protest this kind of earlier this summer, I guess, kind of also played when other information was kind of, other avenues are kind of closed off for information to get out about what was happening there. Kind of seemed, the way you described radio there, Maria, for you, kind of the spirit of that feels pretty, I don't know, as though it's pretty alive kind of now, or has been at least this year, in this kind of extraordinary political time, I guess, where, well, in the US and many other places is living.
I mean, I would say for me, it went full circle, because I stood before the president of Barnard, and I'm a professor now. I'm a graduate of Barnard, and I'm the first distinguished journalist in residence at Barnard in the English department. So I'm a professor, I'm a graduate, and I stood before both presidents at the time, Minouche Shafik and Laura Roxenberry, and I said that part of the reason why I came to Columbia in 1979 was because it attracted me, because it had a student movement. And so here you go, fast forward to 2024, and I'm on the campus and I'm interviewing students for my social media at the time, just going live from location. And the students were then interviewing me as an alum and established journalist now. And so, you know, I'm very, first of all, you know, there should be no more suffering in Gaza, front and center. Second of all, the students should not be punished for this. They're young people, but it did change lives. Those events on the campus changed the world ultimately, and changed lives. And for the student journalists, whether they're journalists like me at WKCR in the college, or like you getting their master's at the J School, there was no better opportunity to test yourself as a journalist than that. And especially having to navigate between, again, I'm a student, you know, I'm paying tuition, you know, I'm a client, I'm reporting about the people who I am paying money to. I mean, all of these complicated ethical things. But it was really, for me, WKCR and Columbia Spectator and the work from Barnard students, that was where my information was coming from.
And that was Maria Hinojosa talking to Thomas Lewis there. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests. And thank you to our producers, Tom Webb and Christy O'Grady. Our researcher was Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu, with editing assistance from Lily Austin and Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.